Top of the afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sawubona dumelang, goeie afternoon. That's a bit of a mix. Welcome to our webinar. This is Beyond the Ballot webinar. We will be unpacking the South Africa's post-election landscape, focusing on risk and everything else that has to do with it. I would really like to take this time and welcome every one of you. I am aware that we are joined here by people from near and far, from different countries. Some of you might be joining in a different time zone. Much appreciation to all of you. My job here today is to welcome you, but even most importantly, to join, to ask for our chairman, Becky Gutswa, to join me in giving opening remarks. So it's that special opening we'll be having the president of AMSA giving his message to all of you. So with that, I would like to bring him onto the screen. Mr. Becky Gutswa, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much, CE, and Dumelang to everybody. A warm welcome to all of you who are joining us in today's webinar called Beyond the Ballot. My name is Begi Kuchwa, as I've been introduced. I am the chairman of the Institute of Risk Management South Africa, and excuse me, it is an honor and a privilege for me to address you today on a very topical issue that is coming from the elections that we've just had. And I believe everybody, doesn't matter where you are in the country, is occupied by this topic, and people are discussing it coming from different angles. The long-awaited 29th of May came, where you had about 58% of 27.7 million people or eligible voters that went on to cast their votes. We saw some organizations or political parties that got rejected, while some shown to be quite popular as they showed some good growth. We have seen new trends and should I say new history being written. We have seen things that we've never seen in the past or in the democracy of South Africa for various of reasons, of course. So colleagues, this new phenomenon has forced us, and me included, it has forced us to become lawyers and analysts. I tell you, look, we had to run to get our constitution and consult. We had to go and read some policies. Some people will understand. There's one policy called strategy and tactics. We had to go and reference on that one, just to touch base with strategy and tactics and what it tells other people on what to do on circumstances of uncertainty. I wonder if they've been using it to consult. But again, one had to go back and check again, what is the meaning of capitalism, socialism? What is the meaning of the right, the center, the right that is not so right, and the left, etc.? So one has been caught into understanding these issues, which is interesting and worrying at the same time. So basically, us as South Africans, we find ourselves in this uncharted territory where, if I can say that, we're in a limbo with not a lot for us to do, but to wait for our leaders to make decisions that we hope will be taking the plus 62 million people that will be taking us forward. So as voters, we had our chance, we went into the polls, we spoke, we voted. And now it's in the hands, for some reasons, and this is how democracy is done, it is now in the hands of a fewer people that will then help discuss the situation and then decide on how it needs to be done. And there are a lot of comments, I'm sure all of you have seen it, that some are participating, some have decided not to participate. We don't know what that will mean at the end of the day once such discussions have been concluded. And some have been arguing that at the moment, the voters have spoken, voters have said, there's no party that will then that has won the majority of leading the conversation or the negotiations. So it is quite interesting what we're seeing in our country, in our beloved South Africa. Colleagues, this webinar aims to provide a platform for insightful dialogue, critical analysis, and collaborative thinking to navigate the complex landscape that lies ahead of us. So we are known as EMSA, that our commitment has always been to empower individuals and organizations with the tools and knowledge to effectively manage risk and seize the opportunities. That's what we do for a living, and that's what we create as the Institute. In the aftermath of the elections, it is imperative that we understand and not only the outcomes, but also the underlying currents that drive them. Today, we'll hear from our esteemed speakers who bring a wealth, expertise, and a diverse perspective. Should I say that we've actually brought in here the cream of the crop? If you look across all our panelists, it's people that are out there that are they know what they're talking about. So we really appreciate their presence and them come here to bless us with their presence and to share with us their insights. So they will help us to sort of like decode the elections results, assess potential risks, and explore the opportunities that can emerge from this transitional period. But I need to say this, and what I've noted, that we have a risk here in South Africa where we as people tend to take what is consumed in the social media as is, without processing it. We're taking it as a gospel truth. The information that is shared by the analyst and others, including journalists, is not a gospel truth per se, but it is for us or for you to assess and reflect and apply your mind. So as risk practitioners, we cannot be found in that situation. We need to apply our analytical skills in understanding the situation. And I think that is very important that we get to understand that. And again, I'm reminded that it is now crucial time for us to acknowledge the risks that accompany this journey that South Africa found itself in. We need to be taking cognizance of the political polarization, economic volatility, and social unrest that are potential challenges that we must navigate with caution and foresight. These are possible risks that may visit us depending on the decisions that will be taken in the negotiations that we are hearing, or that are being held and that we are waiting to hear the outcomes of. So in closing, I would like to encourage you all to engage actively in today's discussions, share your thoughts, allow us to differ in opinion. I think that is very important, that if people have got different opinions, it's okay, we welcome that, and that's actually what is needed, and that's how we grow in discussions such as these. So we need all to engage freely in these discussions, and we really appreciate, without taking your thunder, CEO, as we'll be closing in the end, but I think it's important for one to really express the gratitude to Mr. Jeremy Max, our influencer, and the panelists that have blessed us today. We really appreciate that. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to a productive and enlightening session. I now hand over to you, to the risk influencer, Mr. Jeremy Max. Thank you very much.
Chair, thank you very much indeed, and my thanks as well to the Chief Executive Officer. What a pleasure it is to be hosting this session this afternoon. And you're absolutely right, Becky. We've had to learn so many new phrases in the past couple of days, things like supply and confidence and that kind of thing. So I'm hoping we can make lots of sense, but tailor this conversation particularly to the risk community that joins us today. And it's good to see that we have over 100 people who are with us today. So what do I want to try and do? I want to explore the potential risks and opportunities that the election results brought. Let's have a look at the shifting dynamics of politics in South Africa. And I also want to try and assess the implications for governance, policy continuity, and I guess the most important thing is overall business and a societal well-being. So with that in mind, my guests this afternoon are Malaika Mahlatsi, Kaya Sitoli, and TK Pue. all are highly respected political writers and commentators in South Africa, and it will be an absolute pleasure to talk to all three of them. Just by way of protocol, I'm going to keep a very close eye, friends and colleagues, on the Q&A box, which is on my screen. I will not be looking at the chat box this afternoon. And what I will also try and do, as I've said before, is I'll also try and act as an honest interlocutor between your questions and the guests as well. It's not just me and them. We want to try and bring, excuse me, as many people into the conversation as possible. So I will keep a very close eye on that, and I'll look at those questions and put them on to the panel. So if I could ask my panel members, please, Kaya, Malaika, and TK, to put your cameras on, and let's get the session started. There's TK, and we are waiting for. There's Malaika. Not sure if Kaya Satoli is with us yet, but if he does join, we'll put him into the conversation as well. Malaika Batlatsi, let me start with you first. Then we knew we had a good indication of what the polls were going to say ahead of the 29th. Suffice it to say, though, were you surprised at the result once we saw particularly where the African National Congress had finished, and the sudden rise of the Umkhonto we Sizwe party? And do you think these shifts are good for democracy? All right, I'll tell you what we're going to do. Malaika, we'll try and re-establish a connection with you. I'll ask our production team to help in that respect. Having said that, though, TK Pue, good afternoon to you. And let me put the same question to you. Once the result was known last Sunday, were you surprised? And is this a good thing for democracy?
Afternoon, Jeremy. Is it me? Yeah, and thanks everyone for allowing us to share. Well, look, I was surprised that look, I knew, and I always used to say the debate was not whether the ANC was going to decline or not. I think that one was I baked it in. But I think the margin to which they declined, I mean, you probably, that one, I have to admit, I got that quite wrong. I think I had them probably worst case scenario at 45%, 40, literally scratching 40 if we had to really go back to our old mathematics of how you round things up. Was a bit of a shock. And obviously, look, the players that did well, I think the MK, I always did factor that the MK was going to do well, but I didn't think they were going to almost get the bronze medal, since we're in an Olympic year. And not only just get a bronze medal, but actually get close to governing KZN and just missing it out by 5. So that was a bit of a surprise. Look, the usual players, I think the DA, I kind of had them where they were, in the sense that it's a bit of a flat line. If you look at, all they did was basically get 1% back from the Freedom Front Plus. And that for me was a bit of a disappointment. I think they could have gone on it to be a bit stronger. The EFF, I did see them declining because I think they've sort of missed the zeitgeist of where South Africans are as it regards to issues of, well, I'd say migration, illegal migration, one, and also a bit of where South Africa is economically. I think they kind of have been missing it for a while. And is this good or positive? Look, I think it's good when we can finally see that the governing party can be punished. I think that is a positive, because I think for the longest time there was a bit of a lager mentality within the governing party that we can mess up as much as we want and there's no repercussions for it. So I think that's a positive. Now, I always say not all change is positive, because if we to say how did the electorate actually vote? Well, that is a bit of I think it probably raises more question than answers in terms of risk, because the question is that where they're not happy with President Cyril Ramaphosa's ANC, but they were happy with the ANC under the guise of the MK of former President Jacob Zuma. So I think that probably is a bit of the debate, which I'm still tussling with in my head.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the government of national unity, and whether, in fact, it is a government of national unity, or is it something else pretending to be a government of national unity? Let's get there in a moment. But before that, though, just back to the results themselves, before we start looking at the beyond the ballot, as the topic of our webinar suggests today. What do you think principally drove the disillusionment with the African National Congress? And out of nowhere, what did the MK party latch onto that found such favor with its particular constituency?
Well, I'll say three things, which the disillusionment, and I think one has to go back to the previous election, the high in which current president, I'm not sure, Jeremy, if we call him current or former president Cyril Ramaphosa, because as things currently stand, we're still waiting to constitute a new government. But for purposes of this, I'll say
All will
President
be
Cyril.
revealed Friday. Yes.
We hope. So I'll just call him President Cyril Ramaphosa. Look, the fanfare with which he went in, right? I think there's always this mood in government, which within policy we say the highs in which you go into will always be reflected or can always be reflected negatively in terms of the voting outcome you get. By that I mean, if you remember the New Dawn slogan, if you remember the Tumamina, people did sort of get behind that. And I think even the mainstream media pumped it up to say, listen, here is our savior. Here is our savior is going to help us get out of what I think he and his constituents call the 9 wasted years. But I think as time went on, people really began to question whether that fanfare which he went into was actually materializing into proper, into proper economic growth, one, into proper governance, in the sense that it started to feel as though the old was very much still the new, if you get what I mean. There was nothing he was bringing to the table. And I think a lot of his core constituents, and here we're speaking people, not necessarily traditional ANC voters, kind of started to took a step back in this election to say, listen, you've not really delivered on that. And I think that really harmed him in the ANC. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, it was the issue of where people have always been looking for an alternative to the ANC. If we go back to the early 90s, right? The UDM. This is the General Bantu Holemisa's party. From the UDM, we go to COPE, the Congress of the People. And from there was the EFF. So it was never a question that people were not aware that the ANC was having mishaps. It was just a question of what blunt tool can you finally use to actually get the message through to the ANC? And in this election, I think the MK was that. It was a very blunt tool. It was not to say that people believe each and everything that the MK stood for, because I think it was only on the eve of the election that a lot of their policies and their manifesto actually came to the fore. And a lot of it, one might say, is diametrically opposed to what I term the post-1994 consensus. So I think that blunt tool really came to the fore, and people were like, well, listen, maybe this finally sends the message through to the ANC, because it was neither the traditional opposition parties that sent this message through to the ANC. It was only the MK. And then lastly, I think, and this is where it's a question of, there's a lot of this happiness, unhappiness around most South Africans. You don't have to be in the middle class, which is struggling. You don't have to even be in the upper class. There's just a sense of directionlessness. And usually, if history is anything to go by, if you look at what happened with Brexit, if you look at what happened with how people voted for President Donald Trump, what usually happens when people find that their dissatisfaction is not answered by any of what's termed the mainstream or traditional opposition, they literally do go for this blunt force reaction. And I think the MK is a blunt force reaction. So I think those are the three things that really have kind of put us to where we are currently.
All right, Malaika Matlati, I'm glad to see that you're back with us. And let's see if the audio connection is a little bit better. Let's move then to beyond the ballot box now. We have made our decision known as South Africans. As we speak, talks are being held behind very thick, solid, closed doors in pursuance of this notion of the government of national unity. Malaika, how do you see this playing out in the next couple of days, given that we're up against a fairly tight deadline?
Jeremy, I think maybe before I answer that question, I just want to touch very briefly on the submission that was just made by TK, to say that I do agree to a great extent that part of the reason why we saw the growth of the MK, I mean, the MK party has been it's been a shocker for everyone, right? We must understand that it's not the first time in the history of our elections that we've had what we may call an upset, right? And he correctly traces this back even to the split within the ANC. And I think it reflects just briefly on that, Jeremy. In the last 30 years, we have seen at least about 4 organizations that have split from the ANC, or that have been created out of a split in the ANC, or some tensions within the ANC. We first had the UDM, and in their first contestations of elections, they managed to get just over 3% of the vote. The second was COPE, formed in 2008 and contested the election in 2009. And they got just about over 7%, 7.4% of the vote, to be exact. The third split happened with the EFF, which obviously was formed by Julius Malema and other former leaders of the African National Congress Youth League. And the EFF was formed in 2013, contested the 2014 elections, and they got just over 6% of the vote, just about 6.4% of the vote. And so the MK comes in 2024 election. This was a party that was formed, or at least the law was launched in December, the 16th of December 2023. So by the time the MK goes to this election, it's about a 5-month-old party. And it goes into this election and it amasses just over 14% of the vote, almost 15%. And so clearly, the MK party has done something that no other party in the past has ever been able to do. It is the biggest split. It is the biggest party that has amassed more votes as a splitter from the ANC than any other in history and in memory, right? And I think that's very telling. It's very telling of a number of factors, one of which being certainly FTK has said, just the general sentiment around the ANC as a political institution in South Africa. It is true indeed that not only ordinary South Africans who are outside of the African National Congress, but even those who are in the ANC have been discontent with the trajectory and the direction of the ANC. And you will note that one of the things that, President Jacob Zuma, who is the face of the MK party and would have been the MK leader, or at least hoped to have been the MK leader, even in parliament, and we know what happened with that is not possible. But one of the things that President Jacob Zuma stood on very, very strongly, and particularly towards, his end and his removal from the ANC, was his argument that the problem with the ANC is that there has been a lot of disregard for Congress resolutions of the organization, right? So he always argued that the problem with the ANC, and particularly what he calls the ANC of Ramaphosa, is that it has deviated from the resolutions of the 24th National Congress of the ANC, resolutions around issues of the nationalization of key sectors of the economy, land expropriation, and so on, right? That has always been the Zuma argument, that we have not, the ANC resolutions have been disregarded. And it's very interesting because that argument that is posed by President Jacob Zuma and even members of the MK, and I, Jeremy, was working at the National Results Operations Center in Johannesburg. So I had an opportunity to interview, quite a number of political party leaders and so on. And one of those that I interviewed was Sihle Ngubane. Sihle Ngubane, as you might know, is the Secretary General of the MK party. And I remember in our interview with Imran Rapeti at Newsroom, we asked him, what is it that the MK party stands for? Because remember, Jeremy, when the MK party got into this election race, it does not have policies as we speak. It does not even have a manifesto. They've got something that they call a people's manifesto. It's a 1-pager with just 8 points of very generic ideas of what it says, but it does not even have policies. It does not have a guiding document, similar to, for example, the 7 cardinal pillars of the EFF back in 2013. And so we had to pose the question to him that what is it about the MK party that convinces people to vote for this party that does not have a policy, that has not taken a stand, a very clear, coherent stand at policy level on any issue in South Africa, except to say that we are here to defend the legacy of President Jacob Zuma. And the response of Sihle Ngubane at that time was that the MK party was established primarily to continue the legacy of President Jacob Zuma and to see to fruition the policies of the ANC that the ANC has disregarded. But if you remember, Jeremy, that was the same argument that the EFF posed back in 2013 when it argued that the 7 cardinal pillars to say, the ANC and the ANC Youth League are not, they are not the right vehicle, they are not the right vessel to bring these policies to fruition. That is what the EFF is going to do. In fact, they are going to defend the Freedom Charter. The EFF said, we are the defenders and the true custodians of the Freedom Charter. And so it's quite very interesting and quite very telling that a lot of these organizations that split and are seen to be alternatives to the ANC and so on, do not choose a policy that is different to the ANC. It's very telling about, firstly, perhaps the strength of ANC policies and maybe the hegemonic hold in South Africa and even in the political parties that are emerging. But I also do think that it does talk about the fact that the ANC as a brand might not be a vehicle that South Africans want, but the policies and the politics of the ANC might be something that quite a number of South Africans are still quite invested in. And I think now as we are going, beyond the ballot and so on, there are obviously talks about coalitions. There's got to be coalitions because there's no party, as you correctly say, that has won a majority. And even there, we're going to see quite a lot of discontent, Jeremy. And we saw it even with the ANC. Recently they held a National Executive Committee meeting. And the point of this National Executive Committee meeting, one of the issues was to debate who does the ANC go into a coalition with. Now, of course, there's a sentiment in the ANC that it should be the Democratic Alliance. It is the second biggest party in the country, and it is the will of the voters that the ANC probably works with them. But if you look at it at an ideological level, right, the MK and the EFF, the two parties that split out of the ANC, have got far more in common with the ANC than the DA does have. And that is the big conversation, even in the ANC now, to say, do we go with parties that have split from the ANC and have got some of their own personal vendettas and so on with ANC leaders, or do we go with a DA that we radically have got differences with politically and in terms of policy? And I think that's that's going to be a...
All right, Malika, thank you very much indeed, particularly for that analysis as far as the Mkhonto weSizwe party is concerned. TK Pue, let me throw it back to you then. In terms of the talks that are happening right now, and given the ideological differences and similarities that exist among the constituent parties that Malika has just raised, what kind of outcome are you envisaging over the next couple of days? And whatever that outcome is, how sustainable do you think it will be?
No, thanks again, Jeremy. Let me just quickly go back to, I didn't answer your question about the Government of National Unity, but I'll tie it in with the question you've just asked now. Look,
Same thing, yeah.
Yeah, look, I think Becky Kuchwa, I think actually made a telling point. He says sometimes, what the media reports and how it comes across, and Jeremy, this is not you, because I do know you tend to do a stellar job at this, is I think people have latched onto this idea of Government of National Unity without correctly, putting it together. I always say this, the circumstances are quite different. The Government of National Unity post-1994 arrived post an election, right? There was a result. And the result was the ANC was like, listen, one might say the ANC of that time was magnanimous in what they said. Like, look, let's really make sure that we put our best foot forward to kind of have an inclusive South Africa. That's not the context we have. We have a result. Some might say a non-result, but we've got a result nonetheless. So I don't really think it should be called the Government of National Unity, because I highly doubt all parties and again, we also have to look at the fact that we've actually had a rise in political parties. I always throw this joke around with colleagues that, if we had the ability to this magical formula that political parties just mushroom everywhere, if we could take that source and put it into our SMMEs, because we know our SMMEs always fail within the first 2 years, my word, this country would be something else. But unfortunately, that magic source doesn't seem to be able to be spread around. But look, so we're not going to have a government now. What we're going to have is a coalition in name. It'll just be called Government of National Unity. And this is where, for me, the problem tends to come in, right? Which is to say, we still have the hang up, and I think Malika kind of described it, of ANC policy. I'm one of those who've always taken the turn that I don't think the ANC actually has policy when it comes to economic development. You can look at the RDP and GEAR, there were forms of policy, but they were very individualized and had kind of spearheads behind it. We've not had an economic policy, and I think that probably is going to create a bit of the differences within the ANC, because while the ANC is at 40, the ANC still has the ability to stop or to kind of allow policies to go through once this government is constituted. And I think that probably becomes one of the biggest risks we're going to face, which is to say the coherency of the ANC of and by itself, right? How many ANCs are speaking? We've heard the Alliance speak. The Labour is quite clear that, listen, they're still for Labour, which is going to be quite interesting when we now have a party such as the Democratic Alliance who say, listen, one of the documented facts of South Africa's stagnation with the economy is that our labor laws are quite rigid. Now, how does that conversation start if one of the alliance partners already says, listen, that's a non-starter for us, right? So that's one of the things, and this is just looking internally between what's happening between the ANC and the DA. Now, the IFP, much like the DA, is what I think Becky used the term. I wouldn't say they're capitalists. I think that they're more open to the idea that the market does. And by market, look, let's be very clear, because also that term gets thrown around quite a lot. What we kind of mean by market in South Africa is to say, can you send a message through to the private sector? And here we're speaking about your blue chip companies on the JSE, and sometimes we're also speaking about owners of SMMEs. Can we send a message to them that, listen, we're willing to have discussions and not everything, we're not going to have holy cows. That's what we mean by the market. So the DA and the IFP are more open to that discussion to say, listen, let's not have any holy cows. So that's one angle to look at it, which I think is going to make it quite difficult to go forward. But I also tend to think this is a bit of a positive. Because as I said, my argument's always been that the ANC has been we don't actually have ANC policy. What we've had is individualized policies, right? And one of the areas we should be looking at is to say, listen, when it comes to employment and how we interpret labor laws in South Africa and empowerment, I think it's something, it is a conversation worth having. Now, how that gets managed for me is going to become a bit of an issue, but I think the DA has actually assisted us. If you look at the list of proposals that the DA puts forward, surprisingly, they didn't put empowerment as one of the ports of call, right? What they put on is what I term the bottom nuts of how to make this economy run, right? Which is the rail system, energy, which are things that everybody agrees on, or from the left and from the right. It's just a question of how much are we willing to lean into issues such as a just energy transition, right? Reading DA policy, reading IFP policy, all of them do sort of have an agreement to say that South Africa cannot be rushing towards implementing a just energy transition at the expense of simply getting rid of coal, as was the case for, I think, for the last 2 years. So that's a positive. But it's going to be a loud conversation, because in all this conversation, we haven't even included international players. One of the areas which government sort of took for granted heading into this election is next year South Africa is supposed to chair the G20. Now, we know our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, loves such initiatives, but is it a guarantee that, because normally when you do these chairmanships of the G20, you need to put your country's agenda and the continent there. So that's one of the things that we're going to have a consultation about. What does regional policy look like? Looking at what the elections say, South Africans have started to really question a lot of, and this is where maybe I take a divergent view from Ms. Makhatsi, where I say South Africans are not necessarily happy with the constitution. South Africans are not necessarily happy with the ANC constitutions. One of the key things is, I can guarantee you, one of the issues that's going to pop up is, how does South Africa react with its regional partners? What the election tells us is that South Africans are now starting to question South Africa's openness towards countries such as Zimbabwe, right? That's going to be a bit of a contestation, because the DA, while they are pro-market, while the DA is pro that we should have an understanding that we should be more open about the borders, they also understand that the constituencies are not happy in having a borderless South Africa, right? This is why I think the EFF sort of got costed a bit. Now, the MK, while they might not have what's termed traditional policies, the MK party, much like the Patriotic Alliance, much like parties like Action SA, have actually stated that, listen, we do need a reconceptualization of what we mean about who comes in and who comes out of South Africa. So in terms of our neighbors, how are they going to react to that? Because I hear a lot of people speak about the London and New Yorks, but how is Zimbabwe going to react to the fact that there's no longer the ANC protection to allow for ZANU-PF to carry on with its mess? So it's going to be interesting, and how this is going to be played out is going to be something we haven't seen, especially in Parliament. We have these things called chairperson committees. To answer your question more directly, Jeremy, traditionally they've really been non-positions because they've always been occupied by the ANC. So for its change, we're actually going to be able to see parties, if they don't have a firm, if we don't actually have a coalition which is based on principles and some policies, hence I say it's going to be a coalition in name. But I think what's missing, and this is for me this is a point that's missing in the discussion, is the ANC should have been very clear to say, listen, we are going to concentrate on 3 key things, which all South Africans agree on, based on manifestos, if you had to really kind of summarize all manifestos, which is, we need to get employment up and going in South Africa. Unemployment levels are atrocious. That's the one thing that all parties, left or right, agree on. But that's not forming part of this debate or these discussions. Unfortunately, it's going towards positions. 2, regional inequality. It still makes no sense why Cape Town, Durban, and Durban is, the numbers are going down for Durban, and Joburg, and by Joburg I mean Ekurhuleni and Pretoria, because it's actually one thing. That's 60% of South Africa's economy. That basically means we've locked out the majority of South Africans who don't live in those areas, but we don't hear this in the conversations. And thirdly, and I think it's something which has not quite been shared, the question of, is our civil service ready to handle let's say a multi-coalition party? Because unfortunately, our civil servants have been battered and abused, and some of them are not the greatest. We have to be honest about that. Into understanding, they've been used to the ANC mentality of how to do things. How do you, if you're an opposition figure, get given an executive position? How are you going to interact with this? And we've seen this a lot in local government coalitions, where some of the biggest cries of opposition parties when they do enter is to say it's hard to work with civil servants because A, they've been battered by the ANC traditionally, or two, they've simply taken the ANC for granted and have done their own thing. So I think these are the things that are supposed to be shaping the conversation, but unfortunately that's not coming out.
All right, Malaika Matlati, let me get back to you then, and let's start moving the conversation towards the setting of coalition or GNU priorities. So assuming that TK has nailed it, and particularly with the employment quotient being the one of most concern, how does any new administration, in whatever guise it is, start to get to grips with that? What kind of priorities do you think that they should be setting?
Look, I mean, I do think certainly that TK is correct that the issue of unemployment is a very big factor, and it certainly was a big factor even in this election. It was a big factor in the previous local government elections, and it is not an accident of history that in a province like Gauteng, the ANC in 2021, in the 2021 local government election, really, in the 2021 local government elections, lost key metros in the Gauteng province, right? The issue of unemployment is certainly a very big issue, and it's very telling as well, Jeremy, that in this particular election, the 42.2% of voters in this recent general election were young people below the age of 35, right? And I think we can, at some point when we do a thorough analysis of this election results and its meaning, make a correlation between the performance of the ANC, right, and the increase in that share of young voters, and what young voters deem as a priority, and what then they, as opposed to, for lack of a better word, punish the ANC about, which is the issue of unemployment more than anything else. Over 60% of youth unemployment in the country, over 32% of the official unemployment rate is an issue. But I also don't think that, I think a debate about unemployment is important, but it's not the only factor. There are other very key important factors. And I think, let's take it back to the 29th of May, Jeremy. On the 29th of May, the community of Kiskamazook took a position to refuse to participate in the election. The IEC had set up there at Kiskamazook, and the entire community took a decision that it will not participate in the election process. And the reason that they put forth for why they would not participate in these elections was because they had an unresolved land claim from 1996. So they were saying, we have had an unresolved land claim from 1996. We've engaged the African National Congress-led government. We've engaged all governments on this issue, and we've been fighting for this issue for more than 20 years. We are not going to participate in the election unless that issue is resolved, right? But Kiskamazook was not the only community that raised issues about land. We've had other communities as well that also raised issues about the land question and other issues that are not just about unemployment. So certainly unemployment is important. But I think we need to understand the totality of the issues that confront South Africa today in order for us to be able to make sense, therefore, of what firstly are the policy limitations in the ANC, policy limitations in the DA. And I think TK did touch a bit on the immigration issue being one of them, right? But I mean, I think we also need to move away from what I think TK is a very dishonest argument, which seeks to suggest that, ANC policy on immigration is that anybody must come, even the EFF, right? I think even the EFF, a very social media argument to say the EFF is losing power because of its immigration stance and so on. It certainly is an important question, right? But I mean, we need to look at the policies of the parties that we are talking about so that we don't create an impression that these parties are saying everybody in and, we want immigrants in and so on. But also, even if we were to look at, for example, Jeremy, the issue of immigration, right? And look at the parties that have got a very strong hard line and anti-immigration policy. If immigration policy was really one of the most and key fundamental issues to the South African voter, then that should have seen parties like the Patriotic Alliance, Action SA, doing far better than they have done. The DA policy on immigration is probably the most sensible out of all political parties, quite frankly, right? And it's increasing votes, it's getting quite a good share of votes. And it's a clear indication to us that South Africans, even as they are saying, we need to resolve the issue of the migrant question, the migrant question needs to be resolved and so on, are not necessarily taking a hardline position that says all immigrants out. And that's not a hard position that has been taken by any other party, really, with the exception of Patriotic Alliance. Because even Action SA, their stance on the migrant question is that we want to talk about documented immigrants. We don't want, this is the issue, we want documented immigrants, which is not far too different from what the ANC or any other political party is saying. But I mean, I do think, Jeremy, one of the things that is going to be a key issue in these conversations moving forward, for sure, and very unfortunately, it's not going to be issues about the convergence point at a policy or even at an ideological level. Already, as we speak, before we even get to the table of negotiation, we've already had political parties putting forth their own conditions on which they can come to the negotiating table. I mean, Patriotic Alliance, for example, Gayton McKenzie, the leader of Patriotic Alliance, has very clearly said publicly, we will not enter and have any discussion about a government of national unity or anything of that matter if we are not going to get a position for Home Affairs, right? We want the position for the Department of Home Affairs, and anybody else can take whatever they want. The EFF is saying we want position for, Finance Minister. We want Floyd Shivambu to become the Finance Minister. And we are hearing a lot of this, and that's why I agree with Chike that a lot of the conversation has been about positions. What are the positions that we want for ourselves? And I think one of the things that political parties tend to forget is that when you are in government, you are not there, and especially in a government of a coalition setup as the one that you are certainly going to be having, you are not there to advance policies of your own political party. So if you are in the city of Ekurhuleni, for example, which is currently governed by a coalition of the ANC and the EFF, it is not an EFF. When you are in the MMC for Economic Development, which is an EFF MMC, is not there to advance policies of the EFF. And I think we need to understand the complexity of government as an instrument. It's a very complex thing that I think quite a number of political parties are struggling with and grappling with. And that's why I think the conversation tends to be so much about, we want these positions because if we get these positions, we will therefore advance our own party political agenda in these positions. And I think it's a very terrible reading on the part of political parties on what government is, but also on what is possible once one gets into government. And I think, as CK correctly says, that unfortunately, South Africa, even not just with these post-2024 general election conversations, even with the post-2016 local government elections, post-2021 local government elections, unfortunately, Jeremy, discussions about coalitions are very rarely ever about a minimum agreement. And I think the DA a few years ago, about 2 years ago, posed that argument in response to the local government election to say we should actually institutionalize, but also more than anything else, have legislate coalitions. Let us legislate coalitions and let us have a minimum agreement. And it should not be easy. And the DA made a very powerful argument to say it should not be easy for people to leave coalitions once they are part of them. The EFF rejected this argument. The ANC was not necessarily very, buying into this argument. But I do think that we need to revisit that debate by the DA because it's actually quite a very important debate to say legislate coalitions and have a minimum agreement into which you enter into these coalitions with. And that minimum agreement must be rooted fundamentally towards service delivery more than anything else. And that's a debate that we need to visit about minimum agreements and the legislation of coalitions in South Africa.
All right. Malaika Mahlatsi, thank you very much indeed. TK Pue, back to you. I want to pivot the conversation, if I can, now to the economy. And my question to you is, what risks are you now seeing in this post-election economic landscape, inflation, debt, fiscal policy, and what risks do you think investors are perceiving in light of the election results that we've seen?
No, thanks for that. Look, the key one for me is lack of action on the big line items which you've just mentioned, such as logistics and energy, right? We went into the election and it's always, and I think last 15 years it's been a problem, and we're seeing it in how Transnet and now Eskom and other state-owned entities are going, because you have to remember there's still a lot of them the biggest primes of the economy. For me, if that's probably for me is the biggest risk, namely that ideological, and I always say South African parties don't really do ideology. It's more a pomp and ceremony. It looks nice. It's just to play to the galleries. There's no real ideology in South African politics.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think the issue is that if these issues are not agreed upon, right? In the past, I think, like I said, the ANC stagnation, and it was more internal again, more than anything else. So now you can just project those ideological debates happening about what we should do with Eskom. Going into the election, Eskom was split into 3. It's still supposedly supposed to be ongoing. But how do other political parties now feel about this, right? Some might say, listen, in truth, sell the whole thing off. We really don't need it. How does that play out when we're seeing Eskom partially starting to turn around, right? And those are the ideological issues of saying, what should we do with the idea of coal? So if we have almost like a stoppage in the sense that before, when the ANC used to speak to the markets, there would be a bit of a shock, but there'd always be someone in the ANC who would always say, listen, what we really mean by this is where we're going. Now, how does that work when there's 3 or 4 parties who literally they don't owe each other anything, start to have such conversations and the market is spooked? So I think that probably is the biggest risk, namely the risk of non-action on big line items. And then there's also the risk of, and it's something which if there's one thing I'm glad about the coalition is the, how do I put it? The real reach of government when it comes to the economy, right? Sometimes, and it's an incorrect diagnosis, I think, where people assume that government can actually play a role in creating this employment. I think government sets the room, government sets the scene quite well. But what happens now if it takes about a year? Because what normally happens traditionally is it usually takes you about 3 years as a government. This is when the ANC was fully in charge, for them to actually start to get to grips with what's happening. And then it's normally 2 years of them starting to act. Then unfortunately, there's also the issue of where what used to also happen is, how do you then get your own cabinet in order? And so the second risk I see is going to be the risk of government's reach when it comes to the economy. I think certain people are going to be disappointed either way, because they're going to find out that while government is still trying to sort itself out, they're not going to be able to really answer the key issues of the day, right? Such as, how do you address the problem of youth unemployment? People sometimes make it seem as though you just put 1 or 2 policies there and then this magic thing is going to happen. In reality, policy takes about 10 years to fully take into action. In policy class, I always give the analogy that you see bad policy or good policy after 10 years. After 10 years of it being implemented. Do South Africans have the patience to be able to say, we're going to give whatever policy comes out? And remember, this is the third risk. It's not going to be a particular party. It's going to be a coalition policies, meaning there's going to be a lot of compromise in it, and it might not actually be a coherent policy. So the third risk is it's going to be an incoherent policy. It's going to say, we're trying to speak to the market, but we're trying to speak to our base as well. So those are the 3 things that I foresee as being quite problematic for the economy. Namely that the big line items, energy, logistics, are not going to really be addressed. Secondly, let's say the shorthand of government in being able to truly address problems of the economy. And thirdly, the compromised nature of economic policy that might come out, because it's going to be an issue of, yes, look like you're pleasing the market, but in actual fact, you're also trying to please your constituency. And I think certain parties like the Democratic Alliance, I think, have been wise in trying to say, look, front and center, this is what we're going for, the big line item. So it's going to be interesting to see how the government, let's say the majority party in terms of vote, the ANC responds to that, and how parties like the IFP also respond to it as well. And if it's allowed to go through committees.
So, Malika, let me come back to you, and I'm going to paraphrase a question on the screen, but I'm just going to add a little bit of secret sauce to it. The question is essentially, the economy is in shambles. The new government of national unity, what is it going to do to make sure that the risks for the people of South Africa don't continue for another 30 years? I'm then going to take a little bit of what TK said about the ANC not necessarily having a good track record of sorting things out. Then I'll put you that politics, as we know, is the art of compromise. Yet, are we in a situation right now where we have such different ideas and ideology that they are too entrenched for us to achieve the compromise that we need to make sure that we don't have another 30 years of economic degradation?
Look, I mean, Jeremy, I do think that the issue about compromise it's in the nature of coalitions. Jeremy, I live here in Germany, right? I'm actually in Germany as we speak. And one of the things that is very, very difficult, and Germany is a country with 16 states, which would be like 16 provinces in South Africa. And amongst these 16 states, you've got different governments in most of them, right? At federal level, you've got different governments. A lot of them are also quite, coalition governments. And you would see how difficult it is at this level to even in developed countries that have got longer, longer experiences and experiments with democracy and with coalition governments, how difficult it is to run a coalition government. It is incredibly difficult. It becomes especially more difficult when parties that have got different ideological leanings come into government together, right? or you've got parties that are market fundamentalist parties, and you've got parties that are socialist parties, for example, and parties like the Greens and so on that have got very different ideas about what the economy of Germany must look like. And I don't see how that's different in South Africa. But you're going to have, but these governments, and I must say it works because there are levels of compromise that are reached. But the thing about compromise, Jeremy, is that ultimately, no matter what you compromise, there's always going to be a situation in which one party is not fully satisfied, right? Some parties might be a little bit more satisfied than others. And what tends to happen very often is that the party that is not fully satisfied about the outcome tends to become a bit of a problem in the coalition, right? So it tends to be a bit more resistant to a lot of change, resistant to quite a lot of things, and creates a lot of instability in coalitions. And we see that all around Europe happening. And I think that's what we're going to see in South Africa. I do think that it's more likely than not that we're going to have an ANC, DA, and IFP coalition, and that is going to be a coalition that's going to be a very, very difficult coalition. But I don't think that the ANC and the DA have got a minimum agreement on some of the key fundamental issues that really, inform even support for the African National Congress or support for the DA. And the merger, like to find a common ground and to merge the ideals, rather, and remember, because also what is also, Jeremy, is that political parties also have got a responsibility towards multiple stakeholders, right? So the ANC certainly has got a responsibility towards, the country, South Africa as a country, the markets and so on, the membership of these political parties, right? And particularly in this case, the membership of the ANC, because this is the membership that decides ANC policy, right? Or ANC, whatever you want to call it, policy or ideological trajectory or direction. Those 4,000 plus delegates that sit at
Okay, Malika, I'm going to go back to TK Puer because your screen has frozen.
stakeholder for the
So
ANC.
we'll get back to you in just a moment. Malika, you're coming in and out, so maybe just move around and we'll get back to you. In the meantime, though, TK, what I want to start doing now is I want to start looking at the risk community itself and what advice you would have for risk managers to adapt to what is an evolving political and I guess even legal landscape in this country. The word uncharted waters or words are overtraded now, but that really is where we are. So if you're sitting behind the risk desk in an organization, how does your thinking, how does your mindset need to change?
Well, that's actually a good question. Look, the first thing, and I think it was partially touched on in the opening, is, and look, it's take it as a criticism, which I'm hoping to get pushback on. I've always had this belief that sometimes the South African private sector, and I guess this is why we have now an element, we're starting to see a huge element of risk individuals and risk institutions such as this coming to the fore, is I don't think they've fully quite understood the politics of the state that South Africa is. I see one of your I think it's Mr. Mhlongo who makes a point about Cape Town, right, or the Western Cape, and in a way that's a bit of that's what I'll start off with. I think the risk community does need to probably have a reset on what does it mean when we say risk in South Africa politically, right? There is this, and look, it's even my field is something we're struggling with, the conceptualization of a post-ANC existence, right? In that a lot of the risks that the ANC was traditionally associated with, people sort of baked it into the advice towards the CEOs or even towards their boards. We're now in an era, and I'll say it, that you kind of now have to understand, listen, what does MK really mean? Because I do believe further on down the line, the MK and the ANC might make nice, and that's going to probably present a whole new understanding of risk. So I'd say the first point is there needs to be a reset on how we understand the concept of political risk in South Africa. It's almost like going back to the ground and saying, listen, what is and there's never been, I always make this argument, there's never been a left and right in South Africa. When we say center right in South Africa, it means something quite different to when you mean it in Europe and abroad. So I think the first thing to start off with, if you are serious in trying to understand that, is get a clear definition of what's left and right in South Africa, right? What does it mean to be left or center? And obviously then translate this to how we understand the economy, right? I think there's certain things we'll all agree on, and this is where I think, secondly, you kind of do need to understand that most political parties don't actually pay attention to their manifestos. I wouldn't say they're pragmatists. I'd rather say they're opportunists in who they speak to. And you've seen this a lot with when you speak to the EFF in private. It's very different when you speak to the EFF in public. And I'm sure, Jeremy, you know this better
I'm sure,
than
yeah,
most.
I concede that 100%, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that I think the risk community just needs to probably get an appetite with. And then, look, the third point, and I think this is where uh, I think new matrix need to sort of be developed. And it's one where I'm working towards. I think the ideas of, and I know Mr. Christopher Palm was, I remember meeting him once, it's the idea of scenarios that, look, you're going to make mistakes in how you read the room. And I know South African corporates quite don't like that because it has a rands and cents value to it. But there needs to be an understanding that you're going to make mistakes in how you read the room. In the same way, many people were hedging that the ANC worst case would be 45% to 48%. So it's going to be interesting to see how do you factor that in, and are companies open to understanding that, listen, South Africa, guess what, is a normal country now. There's nothing special about us as opposed to other developing countries. And we need to start to say, how are other developing countries and how are private sector risk analysts actually understanding, how do they understand what it means to live in a country where, yes, tomorrow the president might say, listen, we have signed an agreement with X country, we've signed an agreement with X company, they're going to do this. And over the weekend, that president is asked very nicely to please step down, right? It's not great, but this is how things normally get done in other emerging markets. And then the fourth thing, which I think the risk community kind of has to get to, especially the South African one, is you kind of have to get your hands dirty now, which means you need to speak to these individuals who are on a screen, who Jeremy knows, such as these political parties, and actually get them in the room and say, listen, we get that you're pragmatists, we get that you need to speak the rhetoric, but what are your firm values that you believe as a political party? What can I, when I go speak to my board, say, listen, on this issue, when I speak to the board, they do believe that, you know what, Yvonne, Z, or Gillian, this party said, on this is our firm principle, we will not change, and they mean it. And if they're changing it, they call us into a room and say, hey, look, things are not as I had seen it before. So this is getting your hands dirty to actually start to speak to them. Because I think that's what tends to happen when you speak to other emerging market individuals, that they kind of understand that this is a norm, and maybe we've not had this norm.
It's about getting your hands dirty. And as another commentator said to me late last week in analysis, it's also about business itself and the private sector not being overly prescriptive. Someone said to me that you can't now wish the MK away. They are a serious player in the room, and they have to be listened to and engaged with. And the sense that I'm getting is that people would rather that didn't happen, and that's ridiculous.
It is true. I know you say politics is sometimes the art of compromise, but South African politics sometimes is you need to kiss many toads in order to get to a frog. I think that's the analogy people use. So there is also that reality. And this is why I think the South African private sector, I think, has been a bit weak in that they've one of the risks that you were asking about is you've kind of known who to speak to in the ANC to get an idea of what the ANC, if you ever got an idea what the ANC was doing. So what basically means you need to kind of cast your net a bit wider, because it's no longer if the Minister of Finance, if former Minister Pravin Gordhan speak, that, you know, that's a more sensible idea. You don't wish, the electorate has chosen. And just to maybe make things a bit worse for those that are already having headaches is, I believe that this is actually going to continue going forward, where we are going to see more, how do I put it? You need to have a higher risk appetite in terms of listening to these political parties. Because the other thing is, the longer we take to solve the core issue of, I know, like I said, unemployment might not be the biggest. I still say it's the biggest issue at the end of the day. Because if you look at how even the voter turnout, right, it's going down lower because people are now starting to actually not believe in the system, right? I think our turnout was 58%. And what history tells us, if you look at other countries and look at other countries who are more democratic like South Africa, is the more people don't believe in the system, the more they choose to opt out. And when they do choose to opt in, they go for something which is so shocking to the system that they say, listen, because the system has not been listening, maybe this is the best way to do it. And just a real case study of this is like Brexit. If you look at how Brexit and who voted in Brexit, we all know it wasn't people in London. So it's not people in Cape Town. It's not people in the leafy suburbs of Joburg. It's people who say, listen, why must I care about your democracy, which you say works for you and works for your private sector companies? And I think this is probably, for me, the biggest risk, namely that people are simply starting to opt out of the system. And what we know is that they're going to opt back in. They're just waiting for that individual who, imagine an individual who has the charisma of President Jacob Zuma, who understands policy like President Thabo Mbeki, and who can speak to a larger constituency like Julius Malema. And I always say, for me, that's always been the biggest risk, that we've not yet seen an individual like that in South Africa. And news to the room in this is that individual is coming, because people are opting out and they're just waiting for this one individual who's literally going to turn it upside down.
Wow. So, Malaika and TK, I'm going to start drawing the conversation to a close. Malaika, I'm very pleased that you're back with us. I'm glad that we've sorted that out. My closing question to both of you then will be what the call to action is to the risk community in South Africa. In other words, kind of recalibrating their operating methodology, given that the majority of the audience in our virtual room today is from that particular constituency. And TK, while you're applying your mind to that, Malaika, I don't know whether you want to, first of all, respond to anything that TK said, and then start having a think about how the risk community needs to change.
You know, Jeremy, I think one of the things, and I say this quite a lot, I say it in my writing, I say it in my scholarship, that one of the biggest problems that we tend to have in South Africa, right, is that a lot of our conversations about what needs to happen in South Africa are very state-centric, right? So it's about what the government can do, what the government must do, and so on. And of course, this is important. Government is a very important instrument. But we tend to speak very little about civil society and the role of civil society and the responsibilities of civil society and the risks that arise as a result of either the engagement or even the disengagement of civil society, right? There's a comment there in the chat box about someone who says that, South Africans need to get involved. I think the person is saying that she works at a municipality and so on, and she sees a lot of disengagement there at the municipality and so on. And I think one of the things that I was saying just last week ago or so on to one private sector company, PR Powerhouse, was to say, one of the things that South Africans need to start being very serious about post-election, beyond the ballot, is what participative democracy really must look like. I think we are very deeply invested in voting, which is very important. Certainly, it absolutely is very important, Jeremy. But beyond voting, there is still so much more work that South African ordinary people need to get involved with to defend and protect this democratic project. Something as basic as engagement with our municipalities in terms of the development and the construction of integrated development plans. Something as simple as giving public commentary, participating in public comment in public participation, and giving commentary on proposed bills and so on. Right. Things as basic as that, right? Things as basic as getting involved in the work within our communities and within our municipalities. And I think so much of our conversation about what needs to happen beyond the ballot, what South Africa looks like, and so on and so forth, and even the risk that South Africa faces beyond the ballot, tends to be so much about the government and the state, and that is definitely very important. But when we leave out civil society, when we leave out ordinary people in this conversation of what the risks are, for example, as TK says, when ordinary people opt out of the political system, right? What happens when when ordinary people opt out of the political system? What are the risks that are involved in there? But what happens when they opt into a political system and they vote, for example, say for populist parties or parties that may not have, that may be anti-constitution, for example, and so on? Those are real risks that I don't think we are talking about enough, because our conversations tend to be very state-centric and it's about the state and so on. And I do think that one of the things that I personally would want to see in these conversations as we move forward, but also even in this post-ballot, and that I want to think with Elmisa, it's going to be an ongoing conversation. That is, what becomes then the role, what becomes the post-ballot role, post-ballot thinking and responsibilities of the South African electorate post-election, because it does not end only when we cast a vote, right? The parties are sitting now. I mean, we've told parties that ANC, we don't want you to be the governing party of South Africa anymore. We no longer want a dominant party political system. We don't want an ANC majority. We want all of you guys to work together. But I mean, South Africans beyond simply just, we have said this is what we want, but we are now allowing a situation in which political parties are having an opinion about, who they work with, how they work with, and how. And we're all basically just sitting back and watching and waiting for them to come and tell us what the situation may be. What many people don't know is that a lot of these parties, including the ANC, for example, have got avenues and elements in which ordinary citizens, professionals, students, academics, and so on, can go in and say, we also want to have a seat at the table and talk to you about what we think needs to be the trajectory of this and so on. And there are all of these elements. The DA does that also very well, sits together with business and say, what is the business opinion on this? And what is it? How do you shape the conversation that we want to have, for example, with the African National Congress? And I think there is a very real risk, Jeremy, if we don't have an active citizenry beyond simply voting and to have this very state-centric mentality towards what the development of South Africa must look like. It is, in fact, the biggest risk that we have in South Africa. The simple disengagement by the citizenry with our participatory democracy and its processes.
To the point, TK, and Malika, in the interest of time, I'm going to take those as your closing remarks, and thank you. TK, to you then, the point that Malika makes is very well absorbed. It is about getting your hands dirty, is that if we look at the title Beyond the Ballot, it doesn't stop with just casting the ballot. Effectively, the real work not only begins for whatever form of government we're going to see, but also for citizenry as well. That's important, and it's critical that organizations like URMSA, those in the risk space, are also working hard and making their voices and positions clearly known.
No, for sure. And I think what I think we're ready to get on a practical way forward, especially for URMSA. One of the issues I think was missing in the elections and in the manifestos is the quantification of risk. That really was not present, right? Because sometimes when I guess I can also get into the space where I say, well, look, the risk for South Africa going forward is X and Y. An institution like URMSA would do really well by actually starting to speak to, like the risk of having poor infrastructure. We've seen it with the floods, right? If you don't attend to issues of infrastructure, it would be good if you maybe had weeks like saying, listen, we're looking at the risk of infrastructure. When you say the risk of the market, what does that actually look like? So I think there's a lot of work, and I know URMSA is doing some of that, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to explain to the average citizen who says, listen, I'm struggling with my daily life. Why is risk or the conceptualization of risk important? And also think risk within government. I mean, I can tell you, having worked in government, the risk sometimes is not altogether well articulated in policies. I always say that the reason I do have a go at the ANC, and look, I say it to them, it's not like I'm hiding it, that I think they don't quite quantify in their policies. It's as though they believe you can tell people, I'm going to make this policy and there's going to be no pushback, there's going to be no risk associated with that. So I think URMSA can actually do a job on that. And then maybe my closing shot would also be that, look, we also do need to understand the international community. Look, it's one thing, and I think sometimes this doesn't quite come out a lot in South African political discussion, is it's one thing for you to say, listen, even if our government is working, but I think there is greater risks happening at the moment. Adam Tuze puts it, we live in a polycrisis world. And in this polycrisis world, I mean, we're going to see it now. The UK is about to go to election. There's a certain President Donald Trump who might be coming back. And we kind of have an understanding of how he feels about not just the continent, but also maybe South Africa. And there's also where the Chinese are going. So I think that's why they call it the polycrisis. So I think institutions like URMSA really do need to kind of almost bring it down to government and also to the average citizen to say, when we mean risk, it's not just a fancy word. We're simply just saying, what stops you from having your idealized world? And these are the certain mitigating circumstances. And that sometimes leaders do want to do good things, but certain times there are risks that's even beyond their control. And let's help them be able to better understand that.
PK and Malika, to both of you, thank you very much indeed. An enormous amount of food for thought in that very stimulating 60 minutes of conversation. Yvonne, let me throw it back to you.
Thank you so very much, Jeremy, for that. And again, to our panelists, TK and Malika from Germany, thank you so very much for your time. Of course, we have come now to the close of our insightful webinar, Beyond the Ballot. With this, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to all of you in the room who have participated, who've joined from near and far for engaging with us through this webinar today. Over the course of the session, we have navigated through the intricacies of our recent elections. We've looked into political, economical, social ramifications, all of which, of course, will be shaping the nation's trajectory going forward. Our esteemed speakers were really helpful in giving us the perspectives. They've given us their analysis and opportunities, and with that, I do strongly believe that we are now in a better position to tackle risks that lie ahead. We have touched on a number of issues, just to unpack some of the risks that they highlighted. An issue around ideology and the risks that come with ideological risk in itself, naturally, which is something that has to do with identity and the philosophy of the organizations that we interact with. We spoke about risk of de-investment. We spoke about unemployment risk. We spoke about policy risk, which blurs the direction to which we could be going forward. We spoke about the possibility of economic degradation and what that means for our day-to-day lives and for the businesses that we provide advice for. I want to just bring in a few things from the input that has been shared by our panelists to say, with all of this, there are key underlying principles of risk that have come out very strongly from the discussions. One of those is the issue around the importance of scanning the environment. A number of organizations preceding the elections went out there, did a whole lot of surveys in trying to engage the voters to say, where are you likely to go with the upcoming elections? And the outcome of which might not necessarily show a linear relationship between that and the actual outcome, which says to us, yes, from a risk management perspective, we speak of modeling the future, we speak of scenario planning, we speak of looking into having foresight and looking into the future through the lens of what is likely to play out. So all of that is quite important because it might not get you to exactly where you want to be. We spoke about not being prescriptive, but being able to be adaptable to change and to be agile in what we do, to have an open mind to how things are likely to go out. Nothing will work if we are to take a fixated approach. I just wanted to bring that out, which I think came out very strongly from the discussions we have. And of course, with that, and through all the information that we have gathered, which is anchoring all of this on resilience, it is only through this that we will be able to navigate these complexities. Members, I want to take this moment to really, really thank you, as well as our distinguished speakers, for their profound insights and contributions. Your expertise has been instrumental in enriching our members and the professional body and risk community at large into better being positioned to tackle some of these challenges that we face. And of course, as we move forward, I just want to implore on everyone to be vigilant. Let us be proactive. Let us go out there and explore opportunities. As I said again, there is a call to action for us not to leave everything to the government, in as much as this is a government-centric approach that South Africa has been taking, which has been predominantly the discourse of our governance and leadership in South Africa. There is a call for us to take part, to be active. So let us go there and do what we need to do as risk professionals, as advisors. I want us to, as we conclude, please, to complete the feedback survey that has been shared with us for the webinar. Your input is invaluable in helping us to improve with our future events. But of course, in addition to that, please do join us for our AGM that is coming now on the 25th of June at the launch of the risk report, the 2nd of July, we are also going to be inviting you to join us, as we'll be doing regional visits. Your Durban regional event will be one of them, Cape Town, and then Johannesburg, which makes up the key regions that we have now in South Africa. But lastly, I want really to extend my best wishes to all of you for taking up the time to join us. And to those of you who are certified risk management practitioners and professionals, this is the time that we have seen an uptake on more and more risk managers or risk practitioners to professionalize so that they can be well vested and well equipped to tackle risk management and to provide credible advice to their organizations. Your dedication to advising your risk expertise in risk management is commendable. I am confident that with that, we will help in navigating this country to a better future. Thank you once again for your participation. I look forward to continue this important dialogue, as TK said, with the and working alongside with all of you and the likes of Jeremy. Jeremy, thank you so much for your unwavering support in assisting us to navigate some of these very, very difficult dialogues. And to our chairman, thank you so much, Chairman, for availing yourself to come and share your views with our members. To the IMSA staff, thank you, thank you, thank you.